Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for your own perseverance. Zoom fatigue is indeed a real phenomenon, particularly if you have administrative meetings all morning long, if you are indeed in the afternoon now, such as I did. But I think it's been a really productive and provocative conversation so far, and we're looking forward to another really quite exciting day. So, with that, I'll just begin the panel. We've moved from literal dustbins to the dustbin of history with museums today, perhaps. Like Seravit yesterday, I will show you. Is that right? I can't. Anyway, presenters, I will show you this three when you're running out of time, but hopefully I won't even need to use it. And then, as you know, each of you have about 10 minutes, though we can be a bit flexible and liberal with that. And then we'll hear from Birgit Meyer and have ample time for conversation and reflection. So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker, whom I believe you've all already encountered, Çiçek İlengiz, who is based at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, and she will be delivering a version of her paper Inheriting Love, the Museum of Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi. Please, Çiçek.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Let me share my screen and hope that it will work. How does it look?
Excellent. We can see, yeah, we can see the slide. Now you're in the presenter view, I think.
Okay, great. So let me start with a quote. Muslims go to Mecca once if they are not unnecessarily wealthy. But people of all kinds come to visit Mevlana every year. Why? Because one does not come here only to become pilgrim, but to become love itself. End of quote. When I asked what becoming love means to the self-identified dervish, he told me, obviously you are new and definitely not in love yet. Because if I were, I would know that Mevlana's love is not something to grasp through mental efforts. It could only be felt. He was very right in identifying me as a newcomer. This dialogue belongs to the first day of my fieldwork in Konya in December 2019, right before pandemic took over public space. During my fieldwork, I stayed with love pilgrims in a self-identified eco-humanist dervish lodge that I reserved through Airbnb. Since pilgrims are half tourists using Turner's phrasing, I mainly spend time with them in coffee places, hotel lounges, and in the Mevlana Museum, where people come to inherit the energies that the tomb of Mevlana radiates. The Museum of Mevlana, the 13th century mystic Muslim scholar and poet, attracts yearly around 2.5 million visitors. His musealized tomb operates as a pilgrimage site and attracts a diverse crowd composed of believers of Abrahamic religions, followers of diverse spiritual traditions, hippies, shamans, mediums, and spiritual healers. Promoted as the emblematic Islamic heritage by the contemporary Turkish government and the World Cultural Common by UNESCO, the Museum of Mevlana is situated at the crossroad of different culturalization and heritageization processes. Operating simultaneously as an ethnographic museum, a shrine, and a pilgrimage site, it offers a complex puzzle that destabilizes the categories of religious, cultural, and the spiritual. What seems interesting to me in this case is the narratives of inheritance that are voiced by the love pilgrims. I believe an understanding of inheritance through mingling with energies and distributing the inherited energy further through rituals pushes us to visit the relationality between inheritance and heritage. As Regina Bendix eloquently analyzed, by eliminating the connection between ownership and responsibility, the semantic and political links between heritage and inheritance have been cut in the global regimes of heritage. Thinking together with the love pilgrims' claim of inheriting Mevlana's energy, I ask what it means to think about inheritance beyond shared historical and geographical ties, but through a shared experience of sensing. Although the critical literature emerged out of the interest in studying the tension between the official and unofficial understandings of heritage, it primarily remains concerned with contestation over representations and engaged mainly with material place and secularized forms of analysis, as Patrick Eisenlohr has discussed yesterday. The motivation of this research is to think about heritage outside of boxes of territorialized thinking, with a political sensibility, acknowledging the power relations that are embedded in its production. Now I'll take you into an ecstatic ceremony based on repeated annunciations of prayers to illustrate how inheritance of spiritual love among people coming from diverse backgrounds is materialized. On the small streets behind the Mevlana Museum, there are several houses operating as lodges. These lodges are named with numbers. Most of them are not identifiable from the outside look, and finding their locations requires assistance of an insider. On the one hand, the naming with numbers reveals the history of unofficial survival of lodges beside their official closure in 1925 as part of policies of secularization of the Turkish Republic. The Mevlana Shrine is one of the very few cases that survived through transformation into a museum by being accepted as part of the Turkish cultural heritage. But on the other, the lodges that survived underground attract so much attention during the love pilgrimage that people are not fitting in the houses and continuously rotate with those who could not enter in the first place. While Sufi dervish orders have been exclusively composed of male disciples, during the love pilgrimage, the lodges are hosting people that are not part of mostly any order. Talks on spiritual love, the life of Mevlana and his teachings were given by people who are not necessarily Muslim. And these talks are usually followed by ecstatic rituals such as Sema, the bodily prayer in which the Semazan is manifesting what the God is revealing in his heart by reeling. Let's have a look at what a dervish lodge seems to be during the love pilgrimage. What we see in the photo is the lodge number 5, a group of musicians calling themselves love pilgrims and one female Semazan reeling. A bit later, another Semazan, this time male, joined her doing Sema, which initially belongs to the Alevi tradition that has been systematically and violently discriminated in this Sunni majoritarian Turkey, as analyzed in details in works of Esra Özürek and Jeremy Walton. In the walls of this dervish lodge, the photos of Alevi figures such as Prophet Ali, Hacı Bektaş are hanged next to the images of Mevlana, 7 chakras, and energetic bodies, along with Buddha trinkets. Bandirs, the wooden frame drums that were used in this gathering, carried symbols of Kabbalah, tree of life, and the third eye. The gathering ended with the prayer of El-Fatiha, that is considered the summary of Quran, and this closure was framed as the cleansing of aura, the energetic body. This example illustrates that processes of culturalization promoted the formation of an eclectic spiritual terminology and set of practices without surpassing the Islamic tradition that they historically belonged to. To put it otherwise, detaching the tomb of Mevlana from its religious context, musealization led to culturalization of the figure of Mevlana, which enabled spiritualization of Sufi practices. Through visits to the Mevlana Museum and participation to the ecstatic rituals that I briefly try to depict, pilgrims inherit a particular energy of spiritual love that promotes the dissolution of the difference between the divine, human, and non-human love. Explained to me repetitively in several interviews in reference to Mevlana's poem entitled Mingling, Love is understood as a path of life where every existence mirrors each other. This understanding is not favoring empathy. What Umit Safi calls radical love invites the acceptance that everything, including those that annoy us the most, are reflecting parts of us that we haven't met yet or we don't prefer to acknowledge. In that sense, Mevlana's idea of being one translates into seeing oneself in other humans, in organic and inorganic elements, which does not presuppose a hierarchically differentiated political and ethical subject position. Grounded onto the Sufi understanding, the love pilgrims talk about the energy of love as the origin of every existence. The tomb of Mevlana, which radiates high frequencies of energy of love, operates as a portal opening into a higher consciousness. After the inheritance of higher frequencies of love, the pilgrims distribute this energy to those around them. This process of receiving and manifesting the energy of love finds material expressions in willing. With the opening of the appreciations of people outside the Islamic religious orders, inheritance as a complex cultural technique of preservation using Bendix's phrasing gains a different meaning detached from the property relations that inheritance involves. However, destabilizing the given genealogies of inheritance does not disentangle the notion of inheritance from responsibility, as Adeline Masquelier will also bring into discussion in the next panel. The fraud in the English translations of Hafiz, the Muslim mystic poet, is illustrative about the consequentiality of thinking about inheritance through sensing. Daniel Ledinsky, an American poet who became known as the translator of Hafiz, stated in a recent interview that what he published as translations were actually poems that he wrote himself when he was channeling the spirit of Hafiz. The English poems appeared to him in a dream where Hafiz appeared as a divine figure. In the post-9/11 political atmosphere, when racism targeting Muslims in the US became a strong component of mainstream politics, Ladinsky's promotion of his poems under Hafiz's name is regarded by prominent scholars of religion and Muslim activists as an act of spiritual colonialism that erases the Islamic tradition from Hafiz's work. While inheriting through sensing opens up possibilities to think about heritage in ways that are not bounded to territorialized thinking, it also requires a political sensibility acknowledging power positions that different actors in the fields of heritage occupy. Questions of spiritual appropriations will become a more visible issue with the digitization of rituals and spiritual gatherings during the pandemic. Zoom rituals have not only shaking the sense of the medium in reaching the transcendental, but also destabilize the power relations that are embedded in the material place that rituals were taking place. Showing that one does not need to be physically present in certain place to sense its energies, pandemic opened up possibilities to reshuffle power legacies that the material side of heritage historically inherits, and therefore forces us to pose further questions on responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Çiçek, and thank you too for your relative brevity. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our third speaker on the panel. I am unmuted, right? One never knows. Alice Sage from Goldsmiths will be delivering a presentation titled The Shoe Doll, an Extraordinary Emergent Object. Alice, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'll just share. Okay, how's that? Thank you. Hi everyone. I'm a curator and cultural historian of British childhood, and it's been a really amazing couple of days for me to hear the amazing papers from so many different fields, and it's given me so much to think about. So thank you for organising this. My paper today focuses on an object that I encountered when I worked at the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh. The shoe doll, as she's called, and she is always she. This vital object or assemblage is a doll made of an upturned black leather shoe, clothed in a chintzy dress, cap and apron, with arms made of black stocking material and a face of scraps stuck to the shoe's heel. And in my short paper today, I'm going to trace the shoe's very non-linear journey from waste to heritage, the unwanted materials assembled into a child's toy collected by an ethnographer, displayed in museums, and more recently reanimated by contemporary artists. The shoe doll is part of the Lovett collection of dolls, named after Edward Lovett, a prodigious collector of folklore in the early 20th century. And Lovett has, his name is traced through social history museums across the UK. He managed to get objects, he was a very persuasive man, managed to get objects into many collections. For 10 years, from 1905 to 1915, Lovett sought homemade and improvised dolls on his collecting expeditions through the poor parts of East London, Surrey and Sussex. He found dolls made of rags, dried out fruit and seeds, shells, bones and twigs, materials that really were waste, urban debris and detritus with very little economic potential, that were of interest only to rag pickers and children. Lovett called these objects slum dolls or emergency dolls, describing them as crudely made makeshifts, which were made out of nothing. The people who made these dolls, some children and some more likely, I think, parents or rag and bone man, summoned these creatures from rubbish. They are not waste products, but productive uses of waste. And Lovett's intervention changed the status of these objects, giving them again an exchange value, because he would buy these objects from the children or even swap them for mass-produced toys. And one of the objects he collected in Surrey was the shoe doll. Although he never recorded who made it or who owned it typically, shoes are very potent objects in English folklore, and in his book Magic in Modern London, Lovett wrote, "Of all the objects which in any way appeal to the imagination from the point of view of superstition or sentiment or what you will, there is nothing stronger or so directly forcible as a shoe." And for me, I find the string and the twine that goes around the arms of the doll much more affecting than the shoe. And it's said in folklore that wrapping string around an object activates it, and I can feel that happening when I look at the shoe doll, all of which contributes to the charisma of this object, which often inspires in museum visitors a kind of groaning pity or pathos that's mixed with enchantment. Lovett showed his collection of dolls in exhibitions throughout 1915 and 1916 in Cardiff and Whitechapel. And by that point, he had nearly 700 dolls in his collection from the UK and across the world, organised into his own idiosyncratic taxonomy. In these exhibitions, Lovett reframed the dolls from play to display and used them as evidence for his own theories about the religious origins of dolls. But after these exhibitions, the dolls almost returned to their previous state as waste. Lovett struggled for years trying to find a museum to give them a permanent home, and he was rejected time and again until the National Museum of Wales eventually paid him £50 for the entire collection. And there, in Cardiff, they sit in storage for 40 years. And then in the early 60s, they were offered to the very new Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh, which claims itself to be the first museum of childhood in the world, where Patrick Murray was the founder and curator. And this is him celebrating the arrival of the dolls. As he said, "I'm delighted beyond words with the Lovett collection. The slum dolls alone have made the whole affair thoroughly worthwhile. Indeed, at one stroke, it lifts me out of the realm of kid stuff into recognisable and acceptable folk study." And Patrick Murray's favourite of all of these dolls was the shoe doll. It was, he said, the most extraordinary toys ever acquired by any collector. So in the museum, these dolls were recycled again from waste to folklore to unwanted collection and back again. Murray also made a significant linguistic intervention, changing Lovett's category of emergency doll to the more poetic emergent doll. This new term suggested that the dolls emerged like butterflies from a cocoon from their constitutive waste materials, or even from the children themselves, from the urgent need for a playmate, a companion. The word emergent echoes Winnicott's ideas of transitional objects, produced in between subjectivity and objectivity. In the last couple of minutes, I will skip over the last 60 years of the shoe doll's fossilization into heritage in the museum and take a very quick look at two contemporary artists who have recently worked with Lovett's dolls. In 2013, Kate Davis exhibited 8 blocks of field, a project which called attention to the difference between the literal and playful gaze. The exhibition was a series of detailed pencil drawings of Lovett dolls, showing us that a way of looking can transform 8 blocks into this object. A portrait of one of Lovett's dolls is of course both bone and doll. It's the overlap of both is the space of the playing child, whose toy is both inanimate and alive at the same time. And this is also the space of the artist who produces life in objects. Davis's work asks how much or how little is necessary for a material transformation to take place. And as I've suggested, these dolls embody this idea of transformation through play, collection, recontextualization. Photographer Wendy McMurdo remembers the shoe doll on display in the museum when she visited as a child in the 1970s. She returned to it in the 1990s, using it as a thing to think with in her wider research on play and technology. In this uncanny image from 1998, the shoe is coming to life before us, as the doll does for the child. There's a superimposed face of a child, which suggests to me perhaps that the child is trapped in the shoe in some kind of terrible fairy tale punishment. In 2004, McMurdo returned again, producing this digitally manipulated portrait of the doll, suspended against a rich black background. It's a strange choice of object for an artist who is mostly concerned with computers and technology, but McMurdo describes the shoe doll as, quote, truly a blank slate onto which we could scribe our own identities. I think this captures some of the element of fantasy which greets the shoe doll. Because so little is known about her, there is so much that can be projected and inferred. McMurdo and Davis both visualise the imaginary potential of these objects, and simultaneously, again, the dolls are transformed from museum objects into art objects. This status is confirmed by the attention and analysis of cultural theorists who tease out further emergent themes and associations with the shoe doll and with robots and surrealism. And now people like me who come here and talk about them at conferences. Charles Baudelaire took the aesthetics of toys very seriously and called them singular statuary. He described how the child smashes and punishes their toys, vents their frustration upon their mute familiars. Indeed, it's the truth that toys that survive in museums are often those that were unloved or ignored, because frequently the destiny of the most beloved toys is destruction. This raises the concluding thought then that the actions of Edward Lovett perhaps rescued these dolls of sticks, bones, shoes and rags from their impending destruction at the hands of children just being children, their transformation into folklore and then heritage and then art interrupted one cycle of use, waste, reuse and re-waste and established another of preservation and transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. And we're doing very well on time, I'm happy to say as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce our last two panelists. We have a co-authored paper and presentation now of this of our panel museums and their malcontents. So it's a pleasure to welcome Debbi Challis and Lucia Patrizio Güner, forgive my pronunciation, who are neighbors at the LSE and UCL respectively. And they will be presenting a paper titled From Materiality to Spirituality, Post-Colonial Ethical and Cultural Developments and the Future of Museums. Please.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. There you go. Is that okay, everyone? Good. Yeah, okay, brilliant. I hope you can hear me okay as well. So I'm Debbi, and Lucia will join me halfway through. I'll still be sharing my screen and then Lucia will speak. To start with, we've got an image of the pedimental sculptures of the British Museum, which is called From the Progress of Civilization. And this is really to put this paper in the British context of human remains, but also to really make clear that how hierarchical, racist hierarchical structures are embedded in our national museum and arguably the museum cultures of Britain, as we will show. During the period of colonial expansion and trade by Western nations, there was little, if any, consent from indigenous and colonized peoples to the collection of bodies for Western institutions and museums. The beliefs of those who had their bodies or ancestral dead stolen were ignored or not known. Indeed, the beliefs of those people were far less well documented than the motivations of those who collected the bodies. There were often no records kept because the people collecting the bodies did not think that the dead had records worth keeping. They were just objects to study. Human bodies and body parts were used by museums of Europe to demonstrate supposed evolutionary differences for the application of racist ideology. And this pedimental sculpture has the idea of European civilization in the center, modeled on the Parthian sculptures, with Indian, Pacific and African cultures kind of going up to it in a kind of hierarchical structure. Soldiers in imperial campaigns took body parts as grisly war trophies. A macabre example of this is illustrated by the display of a lock of the late King Theodore's head from Ethiopia in a shop in Plymouth. The lock had been cut from his head by Captain James after the fall of Magdala, which is an image from the same, there's a newspaper that shows the emperor dead, and this is an image from the Illustrated London News from that expedition in 1868. It's known as the Abyssinian expedition. This lock of hair was displayed in a shop window as a matter of curiosity. This was despite the burial of the emperor Terodos, also known as Fyodor, after his death. And it seems to be the same hair that was gifted to the National Army Museum by relatives of Lieutenant James in 1959. After a request for repatriation by the Minister of Culture and Tourism from the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the museum repatriated these human remains in 2018, and a ceremony was held at the museum on 20th of March 2019. The lock of hair was then interred with Herodotus' body and his grave at a monastery in northern Ethiopia. And it should be noted that this taking of trophies was not restricted to the imperial wars of the 19th century, as Frances Larson illustrates in her account of severed heads in the Pacific conflict during World War II. In recent years, re-examinations of these collections driven by the activism of Indigenous people have led to some museums being more open about the historic racism behind their collecting practices, and in some cases returning bodies and body parts. The return of these parts requires museums to understand the significance of those bodies for their descendants, and for those descendants to come to terms with a particularly painful part of their own history. It means engaging with the ritual of return in a way that brings justice or risks re-traumatizing, reopening wounds that has taken generations to heal or has never healed. To give dignity to these returns, therefore, requires understanding the reality of their original location and the necessity of building a shared history and coming to terms with the injustice of the past. The taking of these dead people at the point of a conqueror's sword or gun constitutes a crime against humanity. In 2004, Parliament passed the Human Tissues Act, sections 47 of which entitles museums to return human remains in their collections to tribal descendants or others with good claim to kinship. So that was a quote there. Yet this act was triggered by a scandal closer to home in Britain, which at first seemed tangential to museum collections. In the late 1990s, it emerged that Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool had for the previous 30 years and without consent, retained organs from babies and children and stored hundreds of fetuses, supposedly for medical research. The remains were kept in terrible conditions with little dignity accorded to the dead or their families. And this is an image from the hospital from the 90s. It's changed a lot since then. And there's a memorial to those babies and children just outside. A parliamentary report in 2001 found the use and retention of these organs undermined the rules of the Human Tissue Act from 1961 and the Anatomy Act in 1984. But also concluded that there needs to be more transparency and clarification. So this is why the Human Tissue Act came into force. And the Human Tissue Authority has regulated the display of human remains that are less than 100 years old since 2005. And the same year, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which is the department that oversees museums in this country, issued ethical guidelines to museum professionals. The guidance states that attitudes change over time towards human remains in museums, and that this is a developing issue. We now, in 2021, know far more about the dubious conditions and practices of how human bodies were acquired in colonial military campaigns and by imperial settlers than we did in 2005. The Human Tissues Act has enabled Indigenous peoples and communities in colonised countries and museums to work together to return bodies and body parts due to a scandal within British medicine. Yet, arguably, the Alder Hey scandal was in turn related to memories of the past treatment of dead people in Britain. The bodies of people dissected in Britain, and so many of the collections and medical museums, for example, are likely to be from poor working class communities. The majority of people in the 19th century, whether poor or rich, believed their bodies were needed to be in a complete state for the final resurrection and Christian salvation. Under the 1832 Anatomy Act, unclaimed bodies, usually from workhouses or hospitals, would be taken to be dissected at training hospitals. This, combined with the 1834 Poor Law, which stated only the very poor could obtain treatment, food and accommodation if needed in a workhouse, meant that the bodies dissected from then until the early 20th century were essentially those of the destitute. This was an additional punishment for the crime of poverty, as most people believed in the importance of burying the complete body. Historians, notably Ruth Richardson, have pointed this out as a corrective to the enlightened view of medical advancement that surrounds the Anatomy Act. People, for example, misremembered the time of a death to delay an anatomy sale or to try and raise the money needed for a funeral. Consent about the use of body parts after death wasn't a luxury accorded to the rich and eccentric, such as the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And this is an image of the auto icon of Jeremy Bentham, which is on display at University College London. It's now in the Student Union building, believe it or not. And it's also some images from an exhibition that I co-curated in 2017 at UCL. And I'm going to put a podcast link, which has just been made available, into the chat once this talk's finished, about that exhibition. And this is a rare example of a body, a historic body, for which we knew that consent was given for display and research. And the retention of body parts at Alder Hey was seen by some not just as a betrayal of trust, but a return to the days of the Anatomy Act and the Poor Law. You can make, for example, parallels between the historic treatment of the poor, particularly the Irish Catholic poor in places like Liverpool, and the treatment of the bodies of children in Liverpool. In any case, the public in Britain don't seem to disagree with the display of bodies, but there is a growing emphasis on dignity. And a debate at the World Museum in Liverpool in 2019 showed that 93% of people there supported the display of dead people, but wanted them to be displayed in a respectful manner. Now, this debate was on ancient remains, I should say. And now I'm going to hand over to Lucia.
Thank you. So if we can go on to the next slide. Yet there is a darker side to this taking of body parts of people from colonized countries, specifically for display in museums. In fact, consent or payment, as in the case of the poor in England, was never given by them. Instead, the body parts were used to demonstrate the superiority of one race over the other. Sarah Sloane, who we see in this picture, amongst others, from whose collection the British Museum originated, was a firm promoter of the superiority of the white race. A plantation owner, he started to collect body parts of Black individuals and wrote about the different typology of slaves and their utility for the purpose of work. On the population of Jamaica, he wrote, Debbi, if you can put the next slide, the inhabitants are divided into two groups, masters and slaves. The first group is constituted by Europeans and some Creolians. The second one by Indians, Negroes, mulattoes, Alcatrazes, mestizos, Huerterans. The Indian and Negroes are described from their respective value as slaves from a kind of cost-effective calculation, taking into account aspects such as how much work could be extracted from these slaves and the cost of keeping them alive. And then I won't read it all, but it basically goes on to say that some Indians are good because they don't need to be fed meat, and if they're beaten up, they get up again and continue to work. And others instead are not good because they are used to eating meat and therefore they won't do well in England. But Sloane went on to describe the various typology of punishment and reaction from the slaves, and to explain that however cruel the punishment might be, they were better treated by the English than other European settlers, and therefore should feel lucky to be working for an Englishman. So we have to confront this reality that some museums and their collections originated from this very racist ideology and need to deal with the legacies that this entails. In 1839, Samuel Morton espoused the notion that some races were innately superior to others and that this could be proven scientifically. Conducting his studies on 1,000 skulls, he concluded that whites were at the top, blacks at the bottom, and everyone else fell in between. However, recent reassessment of his studies has demonstrated that by disregarding factors like sex, age, health, and body size, his conclusions were in fact completely flawed. 1,300 of these skulls that Morton studied were deposited at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and after a long campaign by activists, the museum has finally apologized and is looking to repatriate some of this collection. Thus, whilst bodies taken for medical reasons have been defended as at least contributing toward the larger benefit of humanity, there was a brutal political agenda behind the taking of colonial bodies for bone rooms that sought to construct, demonstrate, and justify the ideology behind the imperial conquest. And I should stress that this is the same museum that was talked about on Monday for holding body parts from the MOVE bombing in 1985, just to put things in context. So museums have come to terms with the histories of their institutional abuse of privilege which targeted the colonized, people of color, and the poorest. Before they declare themselves as supporting decolonization, therefore, they need to admit to the objectification of the human and the sacred, and to recognize the importance of these bodies as human beings and ancestors, and to understand that those body parts have a deep significance, sometimes even religious. This image from, the next image from the Oceania exhibition at the Royal Academy in London in 2018 shows offering left next to one of the exhibits, which was in fact, as you can see, a human skull. Offering laid by religious symbols, bodies, and skulls in museums remind us of the deep difference in understanding and perception between the takers and the taken, and for some confers sacrality to the museum itself. In fact, unexpectedly, the museum becomes at this point not just a place of culture, but for some also a place of worship. Here, intangible belief is put on show. The display of veneration becomes an exhibition within the exhibition itself, and new layers emerge behind the objectification of the show. As in this particular case, offerings speak of brutal violence, of untold stories, of dehumanizing dominion, whilst the show perpetrates the barbarity of the taking. There is no doubt that keeping and displaying these body parts continues to endorse the message of superiority of one species over the other. There is another picture very quickly, Debbie, if you want to put it, and then we go back to that. This is another exhibit at the same exhibition at the Royal Academy in 2018. This is said to have been looted in 1903, and it was sent to the British Museum. Again, that's a human skull. But interestingly, the British Museum has never put it on show, and instead it was used for this particular exhibition. Do we go back to the previous picture, Debbie? So there have been very different reactions to these specific issues from a range of museums. A number of university and local museums in the UK are leading the way on repatriation of sacred items and human remains when they are requested by descendants. For example, the Manchester Museum has been returning human remains to Aboriginal communities in Australia and Torres Strait since 2003, and returned some more in 2019. Yet this attitude should be the standard rather than the exception. Information, education, and transparency by museums can help to promote an understanding of the historical misrepresentation of empire and present a more informed account of its reality. And we must remember that museums were in part created for education in the late 18th century, and therefore they're perfectly pedagogically placed to assist in ushering this new era of transparency and social justice. They could be newly redefined to be institutions at the service of society and its development. This is the current museum definition, and ICOM is struggling to find a new museum definition. It's been 2 years that we've been trying to put together a new definition, but this is because it needs to find a way to encourage and guide museums toward the creation of a fairer society, and if it wants to do that, it cannot avoid to take account of this part of their own histories. Thank you.
The deaths of children with disabilities in institutions and judicialization of the state socialist past in Romania. Second, Hans Arawat from Indira Gandhi National Open University in New Delhi will be presenting monuments of many pasts, inheriting or recreating waste. Third, we will have Adeline Masquelier, Tulane University in New Orleans, presenting Heritage as Spectre, Musings on the Destruction of an Icon. Finally, Jesse Falcotte from Indiana University Bloomington will deliver a paper titled Legacy of the Troubles, the Role of Heritage in Northern Irish Ghost Lore. So without further ado, Leyla, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. I have profited a lot and have a lot of thinking to do after these 3 days of workshop. And I will share my screen. Oh, I may not share my screen. Can I be permitted to share my screen? There is a power dynamic that impedes me to participate in this.
Very sorry
wow.
For
all of a sudden, all of this
use
control.
of power dynamics.
Digital power dynamics. Thank you. Okay, so my lengthy title means I will talk about space, disability, and the court-driven way of dealing with state socialism in Romania nowadays. And I chose, and this is based on ethnographic work in 2015 and a follow-up shorter ethnographic research, as well as archival and interview research that I will give more details about as I progress. And I chose to start my presentation with this very evocative image that was taken for the New York Times by James McTway in 1990. Because it was very representative of a particular way of thinking about Romanian orphans, as they were known, or children that grew up in institutions in Romania, and that appeared to be discovered by Western European and American volunteers in the 1990s. Actually, they were neither orphans nor were they discovered, nor was the violence against people and institutions in Romania stopped after this moment. But it is interesting that it is always taken as a reference point. And this picture was interestingly taken very close to the institution that I will talk about, the Neuropsychiatric Hospital in Siret, and it was similarly an institution for children with disabilities at the Romanian-Ukrainian border. And the children there were taken from everywhere in the country and brought there because it was more isolated. So it is still today a part of Romania that is very densely populated with asylums, especially for adults, because they are the follow-up. They are the people who grew up in institutions and continue to live in other forms of institutions today. And this was also the setting where I did my research. And basically, this is a report that shows how this was not a discovery. So in the 1980s, reports about necropolitical practices, letting die, and violence against children and adults with disabilities already started to surface in Western European media. But interestingly, this kind of representation never became front page news or TV material, which brought me to the interpretation that actually the discovery of Romanian orphans was an artifice of the end of the Cold War and the symbolic reorganization of the post-Cold War world. And this has an important implication for what I'm talking about here, because it also implied a certain way of thinking about the victims of these necropolitical practices that started not with state socialism, but actually started with the asylum-based system of taking care of people with disabilities, which actually is inherited by the modern Romanian state from religious Orthodox church asylums, and then is carried into the state socialist infrastructure and extended there. So in a sense, institutions for children and the deaths of children with disabilities becomes an issue of condemning communism and the continuities both with practices in asylums before and after 1989, before 1945 and after 1989 are erased in this account. And at the same time, what is an interesting point, both other types of continuities with eugenics or with other forms of letting die people with disabilities are also ignored in this way of asking questions. And basically the fact that children were understood in that picture that I saw as a form of speechless emissary, what Lisa Malki has called, but also in my context, it is more important to look at the victim status. The child in these courts appear as the ultimate victim, but there is no perpetrator. So these victims without perpetrators are therefore there to be saved by volunteers, but at the same time, their deaths, in case they did not survive, are there to be remembered. And the fact that the perpetrator is not there in the context allowed for these mourning practices that emerge in the 1990s to recognize, together with the carers of these institutions, the deaths of children that were to that date nameless. And to have these practices of establishing cemeteries and small monuments where they are recognized. We see here a monument erected in 1995, but that was continuously somehow being updated with the data of children that grow up, but still have a claim to being buried together with the other children from the institution that grew up, that died earlier. So in a sense, these mourning practices that emerged in the 1990s in solidarity between the volunteers from abroad, in this case, Germans and Dutch, and the staff of the hospital we see here, can be carried out together. But the changes, and the change is relatively recent, and this change is actually the driver of my presentation. And so I will refocus. Çiçek, as well as the neuropsychiatric, so Çiçek, the institution that was the place where the children died that were then buried in this cemetery, and Siret, another institution, another hospital for children with disabilities, were both part of a series of trials in which, initiated in 2017 and 2018 by the Institute for the Investigation of the Crimes of Communism and the Memory of the Romanian Exile, a historic research institution that is also incidentally tasked with alerting the prosecutor's office about crimes committed during communism. They were the object of a trial. And this trial was new in the sense that it permitted an innovation of democratizing the condemnation of crimes of communism. Until 2018, or until these trials, mainly the subjects of trials were people who led, oh my God, can you still hear me? We have a problem, I think. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can perfectly well hear.
Okay, because I have a battery problem apparently in my headphones. Let me switch this system, or alert me when you stop hearing me, okay? Because I will then switch the system. And this neuropsychiatric hospital was one of the, the neuropsychiatric hospital was one of the institutions that was part of this trial. And what was new was that victims were no longer just political opponents or people who had died in prisons, but there were children that had grown up in institutions and that were the victims of the violence and of the deaths caused by institutions. So the victim status was democratized and was no longer tied strictly to opposing the communist ideology. And the other point that was democratized in a very open sense was that the perpetrator status was democratized. Before, generally, the person who would be accused, as in a previous trial, was the head of the institution. Now, everyone from cleaning ladies to political representatives potentially stood trial. This, of course, led to the fact that nobody could be formally accused because the initial accusation lists were too long. And most importantly and significantly for the people who worked in the research institution, they were incomplete. They did not have staff names for all the periods and did not want to accuse only those that they could trace. So in a sense, here we have a very different way of dealing with the past. And this way of dealing with the past and of of accusing people who were involved, but who were part of a larger system of caring for children with disabilities, created a new way of memorializing. And this was the hospital in 2015. So this was the main building in which a lot of children, hundreds of children had been housed, and that the local authorities chose to demolish in order to remove this traumatic site from the town and to make place for social housing for people who had grown up in the hospital. But while this was being demolished, the whole structures of institutions were actually growing in town. So in a sense, this was a partial rememorialization of the space and changing of the way in which past was being enacted. At the same time, when news of this reinterpretation came to Siret and of the criminal trial, something interesting happened in the cemetery. During my fieldwork, I had already learned that the cemetery was a space in which a lot of children that had died at the hospital had been buried. And I knew that there was this plot where the children were being buried, but this plot became a space of resignification. But as we can see, the plot is the one that is closer to here, is basically a mass grave. So here, just from the numbers that became public during the proceedings of the trial, the preparation of the trial, hundreds of children had died in that institution. And actually, even from the official numbers.
Is it possible to wrap up in a few minutes? Could you wrap up in a few minutes? Sorry.
Yes, I'm going to the end. Okay, so the hospital became a space in which the plot became a space in which these deaths were being rememorialized. And if we can see this mass grave character, it is because actually it was sided. So before, the weeds were so overgrown that we couldn't tell, not even these individual graves. But the individual graves are very important because they point, this is also part of the rememorialization in 2018. This was erected. And these also, all these points, like the small graves that were already visible, as well as these graves that pertain to people who grew up at the hospital but died more recently. So since the hospital was closed in 2001 and since in 2018 the trial was initiated. So these show that memories landscapes are changing and that this fragmentation is opening up an ethical space in which these deaths can be recognized and these subjects can be mourned. And this recognition, on the one hand, opens up the possibility of mourning and of discussing how these children came to die, but at the same time, it also led to a backlash of people who had worked at these institutions that were saying that it was normal for these children to die because they were disabled. And one of my interview partners even said, who had to die, died. So this idea of normalizing death has resurfaced strongly in reaction to not necessarily the memorialization politics, but the criminal trial that seeks to attribute individual responsibility for a system that systematically placed people and children in these institutions within that space of that member calls death within life. So within a necropolitical regime that is adversary to them and that does not foster their lives. And this has very much to do actually with eugenics in a broad sense, or with the ways in which the people with disabilities and children with disabilities, because they could not aspire to a productivist order, have been excluded from biopolitical measures that could foster their lives. So disability should be centered in the question of memorializing these processes and not the memory of communism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leyla, for your presentation. Next, Adeline Masquelier from Tulane University will be delivering a paper titled Heritage as Spectre, Musings on the Destruction of an Icon. Please, Adeline Masquelier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. And first, let me thank the organizers for putting together a wonderful set of papers. And thank you to the participants and presenters for a very spirited, insightful discussion. Can I share my screen? Okay. So in December 2017, Tunguma, the stone said to render justice in Dogonduchi Departement in Niger, was stolen. When it was found a few days later, the stone many consider an iconic piece of Niger's animist heritage lay in shatters. The grandson of the earth priest in charge of Tunguma was arrested for larceny after the remains of the stone were found in his house. Meanwhile, the news of Tunguma's disappearance spread across the region, causing consternation in some circles and mild relief in others. In July 2018, I met with a local judge after learning that the shattered remains of Tunguma, which constituted evidence in a criminal case, were in his possession. When I walked into his office, he proceeded to unwrap the cloth bundle on his desk. Nested inside the cloth were hundreds of loose rock fragments of different sizes. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he blurted out. The judge's questions signaled that while Tunguma had been ostensibly reduced to an unsightly pile of rubbish, it was not discardable. Waste, Francisco Martinez suggests, is the opposite of commitment. It entails disinvestment, disaffection. Messy as they were, the stone's remains retained an eerie quality that was powerfully effective, akin perhaps to what Kathleen Miller in her ethnography of garbage collectors calls a vital liminality. Legend has it that Tunguma led the first Saraunia, the queen priestess who fled the pre-colonial Hausa kingdom of Daura for the village of Lugu in today's department of Dogonduchi, where she founded a dynasty. Every woman from the royal lineage who had succeeded her had acted as the stone's guardian. When a dispute arose between two parties, rather than turn to justice officials, the parties would travel to Lugu and request that Tunguma adjudicate on the matter. The stone, no more than 12 inches in diameter, would be carried in a net, suspended from a yoke resting on the shoulders of two men. If one of the litigants was innocent, Tunguma would push its carriers away from him. If he was guilty, the stone would violently pull its carriers toward him. To avoid being crushed, he had no choice but to throw himself to the ground, a sure sign of guilt. The process was said to be infallible. Tunguma did not make mistakes. The thief, whom I called Salifu, told the police he had not acted alone. It was, he claimed, the spirit of Tunguma himself, who, after converting to Islam, had ordered him to destroy the stone. How else would he have been able to cart off the stone on his motorcycle and carry it home? According to Salifu, Tunguma had become a source of ill-gotten gains. Whereas litigants once brought small gifts to Tunguma's caretakers, they now had to hand in large sums of money before presenting their case to Tunguma. Desirous to curb such uncontrolled pursuit of wealth, the spirit had told Salifu to destroy the stone. Now, I follow Tim Ingold in seeing Tunguma's animacy as not the result of an infusion of spirit into substance or of agency into materiality, but rather something that is ontologically prior to their differentiation. Not differentiating Tunguma the spirit from Tunguma the stone created something of a headache for local authorities. For one thing, should they treat the theft of Tunguma as an instance of heritage loss in a conventional sense, or something more? For many, the destruction of Tunguma signaled the end of an era. A school teacher told me a page has been turned in the history of animism. In the past century, religious reforms aiming to standardize Islamic practices have destroyed spirit shrines, including trees, banned spirit-central rituals, and encouraged people to abandon spirits altogether. The landscape that once pulsated with invisible forces became an inert backdrop against which human agency, with God's support, could be deployed. Spirits were neglected, features of the landscape became things. Yet, Islamic iconoclasm did not erase the past. Today, the spirits linger over the places they once called home, occasionally avenging themselves on the living. Their spectral presence undermines the pastness of the past, raising questions of responsibility, and accountability. Who should care for the spirits? Insofar as spirits bear witness to previous epochs, serving as the bridge between the living and the dead, what form does inheritance take for those who remain haunted by the past? Is inheritance even possible for one who rejects one's debt to past generations? Now, I question the view that the stone disappearance can be summed up as turning a historical page, and inspired by Anne Stoller, try to think instead with the multiple tenses that Tunguma's spectral presence invokes. Rather than focusing then on the stone's fragments as inert remains, I consider the history they recruit and that unite disparate temporalities, topographies, and agencies. Dispensing with the discrete temporalities that page turning requires means our understanding of heritage must make room for the way in which the past is alive, infiltrating the present and weighing on the future. When summoned by the authorities to verify the provenance of the rock fragments, the guardians of Tunguma declared the rubble were not the remains of the famed stone. Not only were the fragments fake, but the real Tunguma was now hidden away, they said. Such claims were aligned with a broader narrative that ties Islamic iconoclasm with diminished knowledges and ecologies, while framing the past as a haunting presence. Although Islamic reforms allegedly made a break with the animist past, this past routinely leaks into the present in the form of spiritual attacks, haunted places, and frightening encounters with otherworldly creatures. By denying the theft of Tunguma, the stone's guardians rejected the notion that the stone was part of what Marilyn Ivy calls the vanishing, marginalized practices suspended at moments of impending disappearance. They also complicated the judge's task. Had a crime actually been committed? Was the pile of rubble evidence of such a crime? More importantly, perhaps, what should be done with it once the presumed thief had been sentenced? The reputation of Tunguma, known in French as La Pierre Sacrée, had spread beyond Niger's borders. Foreigners had visited Lugu to meet Tunguma. As a fixture of the animist landscape, the stone had inspired numerous journalistic, touristic, and anthropological accounts. The judge knew this. He also knew that the fragments could not be returned to their rightful guardians, who refused to recognize them as genuine. Turning them over to a museum would draw unwarranted attention to the unfortunate incident and solidify the narrative of a waning animist tradition. The alternative, getting rid of the debris, was equally impractical. Now, according to Salifu, Tunguma, having converted to Islam, could no longer arbitrate disputes in an animist fashion. By ordering Salifu to destroy the stone, the spirit performed an act of iconoclasm. But I want to address not the spirits, but the man's iconoclasm. By shattering the stone, Salifu rejected his inheritance. That is, he refused to endorse the animist mantle he would have inherited one day. The descendants of the region's first settlers, who still claim ties to the land through the propitiation of spirits, are now a tenuous minority. Their role as ritual expert has been eclipsed by others, mostly Muslim religious specialists. When selected, a new priest cannot, in theory, escape his obligations, for he's regarded as the custodian of a collective heritage. In past decades, however, some people have abdicated their responsibilities as heirs to a priestly lineage and followed divergent paths. Salifu was one of those people. His inheritance was burdensome and he wanted none of it. By smashing Tunguma, he took away part of the power of the office his grandfather held and declared himself a buffered subject, to paraphrase Charles Taylor. That is, a person who is no longer open, vulnerable to a world of spirits. Now, this essay has been an attempt to ponder what Tunguma's destruction exposes about the transmission of heritage in a place where the past is often experienced as a haunting, burdensome presence. Inheritance for Jacques Derrida is never a given. It is always a task. There's no inheritance without a call to responsibility, Derrida writes. What happens to the past when some refuse to assume their inheritance? Prior to its destruction, Tunguma, seen by many as the most important pre-Islamic artifact in the region, had been entangled in diverse processes of revitalization, mystification, appropriation, and neglect. Once reduced to rubble, it was reclaimed by some, but for most, it became a source of abjection or ambivalence. Taking Derrida's notion that one never inherits without coming to terms with some specter as a point of departure, I've tried to consider the tension between heritageization and wastification through a discussion of Tunguma, its inconvenient presence, and its haunting yet also abject qualities. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeline. Next, Jessie Pavkot from Indiana University Bloomington will be presenting a paper titled Legacy of the Troubles, the Role of Heritage in Northern Irish Ghost Lore. Please, Jessie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's go here. Can everyone see my PowerPoint? Okay. Perfect. So today I want to think about this haunting legacy of the Troubles. Near 30-year civil war in Northern Ireland took place from 1968, 1969, roughly, to 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So since 1998, there's been an ongoing peace process that has been taking place. But I want to think about the ways in which this traditional narrative, this traditional repertoire of narrative of ghost narratives has come to mean something else in contemporary Northern Ireland, and what role heritage plays in that. Okay, so first I want to start off with this idea of the haunting legacy of the Troubles. And as it has been mostly seen by journalists, politicians, and even academics, since the spectral turn, the turn to hauntological studies in the 90s, has been that of a conceptual metaphor. That this disjuncture in time, the violent past of the Civil War has not left, that you can feel the presence there, both in architecture, as you see here, these peace lines, or these peace walls that line throughout Northern Ireland that separate Protestants and Catholic communities in certain areas, or even through other visible means, such as the memorial wall art there. But the point here is that it's often seen just as metaphor, just as something that we can throw out, but doesn't have any ontological affect on Northern Ireland, but I want to complicate that. So here are just a couple of news headlines. Legacy of the Troubles still haunts Northern Ireland, and specifically as it relates to Brexit, this has come up again and again. Northern Ireland's stormy past haunts UK efforts to leave the EU. But there is, like I've said, this traditional form of ghost narratives that is not about a conceptual metaphor. It is about emplacing violence, emplacing death, that sees the ghost not as metaphor, but as a social actor within the community. So here I'm using heritage, the way that Barbara Kirshenblatt Gimlet defines it as the transvaluation of the obsolete, the mistaken, the outmoded, the dead, and the defunct. I want to highlight the dead here and add to this the undead as well. So within contemporary Northern Ireland, ghost narratives are seen as carryovers from a previous age. They're not seen popularly as something that is a vital living tradition, but rather something that must be preserved by folklorists, both amateur and professional, by professional storytellers, and even by ghost hunting groups to keep, because they are vanishing from the contemporary world. Now, along with this, some ghosts are remembered and others forgotten, just goes along with all things. But I am using Guy Biner, the folklorist and historians, understanding that social memory and social forgetting are social processes, that some ghosts are chosen, are picked out and put on display as heritage to say that we will remember these ghosts, and other ghosts are intentionally forgotten. They are made invisible and not speakable. And then lastly, because of this mechanism of social remembering and forgetting, there are tensions between official heritage displays such as museums and tourist agencies and unofficial heritage displays, often in oral narrative traditions, but there are book compilations as well that hold these narratives as objects of the past and represent them to contemporary Northern Irish society as where we have come from. So a lot of this has to do, I just want to point to that first item there of this notion that these are of a bygone era. This is one of my interlocutors, Kevin Murphy, who really hits on what Clodagh Harvey points to, that the introduction of the automobile, of the internet, of electricity, TV, radio, has really killed these old forms. And this is the popular perception of that. Again, these things need rescued, which is why certain semi-official and official organizations such as the Anaclone Historical Society, which Polly McCrory is a part of, have chosen to go out and to record these narratives before they're gone. So a couple years ago, the Anaclone Historical Society published Ghost Stories of Ulster. And they said many years ago, there was no electricity, television, or internet. These stories were kept alive by word of mouth, passed down through the ages. And there seems to be this rupture there, that once this was a living tradition, now it's not. And so it's bound up, these stories are bound in books and ghost tours and put on display back to the people to say, we're no longer a part of the society, but this is where we come from. And because of that tension between these, we see places of official heritage display in Northern Ireland, such as the Crumlin Road Jail here, putting on paranormal tours, ghost walk tours, Victorian tours. And when they first started these tours, this is a popular tourist destination in central Belfast, they first put this on, they asked Warren Coates, a local paranormal investigator, to come in and design this tour, but he was expressly told he could not talk about ghost stories of the Troubles, that they needed to separate this. The jail is known in its most recent history as an icon for holding political dissidents, paramilitary members, and larger figures having to do with the violence that occurred during the Troubles. But when doing these paranormal and ghost walks, they're specifically set to put them within a Victorian era, that these are supposed to be the ghosts and the stories of a time gone by. He was told that they could not talk about the Troubles, especially as they related to ghosts. And if anyone on the tour asked about it, they could get their information, email them Wikipedia links to the Troubles, but their official stance as docents was not to discuss that. So this gets to the case study that I want to kind of see this play out in. This is a double haunted location, more than double haunted, but I'm just going to focus on two. This is Narrow-Water Castle here, seen on the border of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Has a lot of tragic events associated with it, but I'm just going to talk about the two in which predominant ghost narrative complexes come out of. So August 27th, 1979, the Irish Republican Army detonated 2 bombs while they knew a British military envoy would be going by. It ended up killing 18 of those soldiers, and it's the largest death toll to soldiers in a single instant during this 30-year conflict. Immediately after this, stories started to circulate about seeing ghost soldiers, and they often form like this. This is from a Reddit post a few years ago. There's a story about an army checkpoint that was ambushed by the IRA, and they were killed so fast that their ghostly remains are still intact. There have been numerous accounts of people driving to a checkpoint, and upon being stopped and asked to produce a driver's license ID, the soldier disappears. Often the entire checkpoint would disappear as well. Someone else responded, yeah, that's down by Narrow-Water. My friend's dad saw that, he's not one to lie. And then a short discussion on why aren't there more Troubles related ghosts or ghost stories about this. So that's the first one. People show up, they're pulled over by British military, asked to produce their license, and then they vanish, the soldier vanishes. But there's this other complex there, this other ghost that is inhabiting this very spot, and that is of Lasara. So this one takes place in the 1640s. Lasara is the Chief McGuinness's daughter. She falls in love with the wandering harper, seen in this illustration to the right. And they are fleeing after Narrow-Water has been garrisoned by a troop from the north. As they're fleeing, they're spotted, they are shot at, the harper dies. Lasara is brought back to Narrowwater Castle, where she's given the option to marry the warden or to die. She runs up to the top, throws herself off to kill herself to be with her lover. And it's said on a windy night or a stormy night that you can see her floating from the top down there. You can hear her lover playing this music. This is a transcription of one of these narratives collected in the 1930s during the Irish Folklore Commission's school schema. But Lasara is also the official ghost of Narrowwater. She's the one that is represented in tourist books. As seen here, this is a book that if you're walking or driving around the border of Northern Ireland, you'll find her there, or even on the official signage right outside of Narrowwater, posted by the Tourist Board of Northern Ireland. So this one, and producing the history of this castle and how it has changed hands, at the very end, puts this legend of Lasara, making her this official ghost. But there are other ghosts there, namely that of the Vanishing Soldier. Now, in all ways, the Vanishing Soldiers are made unofficial. They are not in guidebooks. They are not on the official signage. And even their memorial, which stands right across from that official signage of Narrowwater at the castle itself, is unofficial. It's put up by local community members, and when it is sometimes vandalized, it is re-put up by community members. The only thing that you can find there that marks this landscape, well, is this unofficial monument, but this plaque on it that reads, this plaque was erected in the memory of 18 British soldiers murdered by Irish Republican terrorists in the Narrowwater bombing. We will remember them. So again, we have this distinct coming together of this group saying, we must remember this. This isn't something that we can forget. However, the ghost, this actual haunting of it, that disjuncture that places the victims, the murdered British soldiers there, are not discussed. They are not talked about. Very often, this is only found in oral tradition, been cataloged and written about by certain folklorists, but there's only one instance that this shows up in a book, but it's a weird instance. So just by way of offering some conclusions to this, this place is doubly haunted, but only partially speakable. So I want to think about that. Lasara is made the official ghost of Narrowwater Castle, occupying the space of the heritage ghost. She is bound up. She's made an object that can be put on display, that can be seen as from this other time. The ghost soldiers, the vanishing soldiers, are left unofficial in narrative, memory, and memorial. And in thinking about this particular complex and how these overlay and fall into one another at this site, I think it's really interesting to think about what other ghosts belong to locales that have not been elevated to this realm of heritage, and thinking Civil War plantation ghosts within the United States is one example. Industries like ghost tourism, certain ghosts are named, but what are the ghosts who aren't? How are they remembered, obscured, or forgotten? And hopefully we can talk about some of those things after this, but thank you.